Hey everyone, welcome back to another Sunday afternoon Bible study. We are doing a study on the attributes of God, and today we are looking at the book Behold Your God, The Weight of Majesty by John Snyder. We are talking about the omnipresence of God, or knowing the God who is everywhere. And so let's dive right back into this study. If you've missed any of these studies on the attributes of God, you can go to our YouTube channel. There's a playlist and you can catch back up. This is, I think, study number 7. So if you've missed any of those, you want to go back and catch up, I would encourage you to do that. Let's talk about this idea of knowing the God who is everywhere. First of all, let's think about this idea, the God whose presence is infinite. So I think it was 2 studies ago we talked about the infiniteness of God. Another way that you can express the infinity of God is in his presence. So we asked the question, where does God live? Well, he doesn't have a physical address. We don't get that. We very much define ourselves by where we exist at this moment. If you open up your smartphone and you open up your map program and you say, find my location, it's going to find coordinates on a map as to where you are. And that's easy for us to think about, easy for us to answer, but where is God? This is a question that's so significant. And it's easy for us to answer. You've known the answer to this question since you were a little kid in Sunday school, most likely. It's a whole nother matter to live your life every moment with a practical awareness of the fact that God is everywhere. God is everywhere at all times. And of the many attributes that reveal to us the majesty of God, his all presence has such a potential to alter everything about the way that we live. If you believe this truth, it will do 2 things. It will either cause you to live with despair, or it will fill you with hope that God, the everlasting, eternal, infinite, wonderful God that you read about in the Bible, is here with us right now. We could say that God calls all places here. That's the best we can do when we're trying to understand a God whose presence is infinite. All places are here to God. Again, it's one of those attributes that we just don't live practically with this knowledge in our life. Genesis 28 and verse 16, Jacob says, "Surely the Lord is in this place, and I did not know it." And that's the way too many of us live our lives. Like, we know in our mind that God is here. All places are here, so he's here right now in the moment. But we don't live that way. Because if we would have believed that, we most likely would have lived differently. And so let's get into this idea of the God who is everywhere. Here's a good quote. A heathen philosopher once asked, "Where is God?" And the Christian answered, "Let me first ask you, where is he not?" Timothy Dwight says, "He dwells throughout the known universe and the uninhabited regions of immensity." I'm very thankful for smart men and women that can say things way better than I can. The uninhabited regions of immensity. We serve a great God. What about this quote? God is over all things, under all things, outside all, within but not enclosed, without but not excluded, above but not raised up, below but not depressed, wholly above, presiding, wholly beneath, sustaining, wholly within, filling. It's incredible. It's just the majesty of the God that we serve. Well, let's look at some classic passages from the Bible about the omnipresence of God. Probably the most classic, Psalm 139, verse 7 through 12. Where shall I go from your spirit? Or where shall I flee from your presence? If I ascend to heaven, you are there. If I make my bed in Sheol, you are there. If I take the wings of the morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea, even there your hand shall lead me, and your right hand shall hold me. If I say, surely the darkness shall cover me, and the light about me be night, even the darkness is not dark to you. The night is bright as the day, for darkness is as light with you. Another very classic text, Jeremiah 23, verses 23 and 24. Am I a God at hand, declares the Lord, and not a God far away? Can a man hide himself in secret places so that I cannot see him, declares the Lord? Do I not fill heaven and earth, declares the Lord. Wow. Fills heaven and earth. Again, all places are here for God. He fills the entirety of heaven and earth. What about in the New Testament? This sermon by the Apostle Paul in Acts 17, that they should seek God and perhaps feel their way towards him and find him, yet he is actually not far from each one of us. For in him we live and move and have our being, as even some of your own poets have said, for we are indeed his offspring. God is everywhere. We live in him, we move in him, and we have our being in God. So let's ask the question, what does this tell us about God? And we're going to just look at 6 statements that summarize what God's all-presence means. What does it tell us about God? So number 1, God is in every place, yet he cannot be contained within any one place. And God's a being unlike us, so I can't really wrap my brain around that, but that's true of God. Number 2, God is in every place at once, rising above all limitations of place in the same way he rises above all limitations of time. He fills all places with his presence as he fills all times. Wow, this is neat. I think the thing that's helped me really think about this a lot and dwell on this is that statement that all places are here to God. And then last week, if you remember, we said all time is now. So God fills up every moment of time and he inhabits every place all at once, which is mind-bogglingly really amazing. God is a great God. Number 3, terms of distance mean nothing to God. When he speaks of his essential presence, nothing can be far from him. He has never traveled. So when you're traveling in the car and your kids ask, are we there yet? God never has to ask that question. He's never traveled. Every place is here. And that's number 4. All places are here to God. All times are now. And God is solitary and unique in this perfection. No other being is omnipresent. That's comforting. Satan is not omnipresent. Satan cannot be in all places at once. So oftentimes, I just kind of think I'm way too insignificant for Satan to bother me. Of course, he's got, a third of fallen angels to help him in that. So there is definitely a real spiritual warfare going on, but it's comforting to know that only God is omnipresent. And then number 6, God's infinite presence is essential to his nature. It comes as naturally to God as being human comes to us. He does not need to exert effort to extend his presence to all places at once. And this is really helpful, even when you think of any attribute of God. It's essential. It comes naturally. It's easy. He doesn't strain himself to be omnipresent. He just is. You don't strain yourself to be a human being. You just are. And God is so infinitely wonderful that he is in all places, in all times. Every place is here, every time is now to God. All right. So, go back and think through those 6 implications again and meditate on them and really concrete in your mind. Think accurately about God, right? Don't have a an understanding in your brain and your imagination of who you think God to be that isn't accurate to what he reveals about himself in the Word of God. So make sure you take some time to dwell on those and think through those and go back through some of these verses in the Bible and really fill your mind with the truth of who God is. So then let's move on and talk about some implications for those who would live with God. What are some implications that we can begin to draw out? And way more than what we'll talk about here this afternoon, but what are some? Well, implication number one, God is the unchanging environment of every person. So in the Old Testament, the patriarch Jacob blessed his son Joseph. He referred to God as, in Genesis 48:15, the God before whom my fathers Abraham and Isaac walked, the God who has been my shepherd all my life long to this day. Later, the prophets, Elijah says this, as the Lord of hosts lives before whom I stand, I will surely show myself to him today. And then his replacement, Elisha, said in 2 Kings 3:14, as the Lord of hosts lives before whom I stand. And so maybe he learned that from Elijah, his mentor. I don't know. But all of these men of old lived as if God was the environment of their everyday lives. And certainly the Apostle Paul expressed it wonderfully, and we've already looked at this, but Acts 17:28, in him we live and move and have our being. God is our environment. And this should bring us a great deal of stability and comfort to the believer. In the 19th century, the Scottish missionary to China, William Burns, was leaving his friend and co-worker Hudson Taylor. Burns faced this hardship with unshaken hope, and he gave his reason. He wrote that, though he was losing the companionship of a friend and moving to a new part of China, God remained his unaltered environment. And that was enough for William Burns. So, can you think of a time in your life when the fact that God is your unaltered environment was a particular comfort to you? Usually it's those valleys of deep darkness. Psalm 23, if you learned that King James, I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, probably valley of deep darkness. So, for me as a pastor, when I go through times of uncertainty with the church, when families leave the church, when I get, just discouraged and down, sometimes it's my family. Sometimes it's watching my kids having to go through a particular sickness or disease, or even watching my kids act out in rebellion against me and against God. Knowing that God is my environment is of particular comfort. What about you? How is that comforting to you? John Macduff said, "The omnipresence of God, a gracious antidote to every earthly sorrow." And what a wonder it is that we serve that kind of God. Implication number 2, God is present, observing all events in all places at once. So God doesn't really, think about this, God doesn't just know about the events of your life. God attends the events of your life. So the motions of an insect, the rotation of a planet, the crawling of a worm, and the labors of an archangel, God attends those. He's present at the birth of every star in the galaxy, and he is with every graveside mourner. He is filling all these places and observing all these events. God doesn't merely know all, he is the eyewitness of all. It's a sobering thought. God is an eyewitness of all that you do. And remember from last week, he fills every moment. God still is eyewitnessing everything that you have done, that you will do today, or that you have yet to do in the future. He is observing all events in all places at once. whether we invite him to do it or not, he's with us. Whether we agree to the fact of his presence or not, he is present. So consider these verses carefully. Hosea 7 verse 2. God says, "But they do not consider that I remember all their evil. Now their deeds surround them. They are before my face." All of your deeds right now are before the face of God. He is an eyewitness to them. Ezekiel 9 and verse 9. "Then he said to me, the guilt of the house of Israel and Judah is exceedingly great. The land is full of blood, and the city full of injustice. For they say, the Lord has forsaken the land, and the Lord does not see." We would never say that, right? Of course, the Lord sees everything, but how often do we live exactly like that? Job 22, verses 12 and 13. "Is not God high in the heavens? See the highest stars, how lofty they are. But you say, what does God know? Can he judge through the deep darkness?" So that idea that somehow I can hide myself from God, I can get in darkness and do something that is outside of the purview of God. Again, probably not something we would say out loud, but something that we most likely live. We live with that kind of ignorance every day. So we've got to ask the question, do you see that every sin in some measure is born out of the practical denial of God's presence? The verses that we just read represent people who wish to devote their lives to selfishness. They comfort themselves with a number of lies regarding God's all-presence. What are some of those lies? What are some of those lies that we might not say, but we live on practically every day of our life? How about this? Well, I can do this in secret. God's not going to witness this. Or God doesn't remember my sin any longer. Or God has forsaken me. I can do what I want. Are we tempted to believe these or similar lies about God's presence? Each of us will come to grips with the unalterable truth that the judge of all the earth has been an eyewitness to every action. He was with me when I did, thought, and said everything. There is no hope of offering him false evidence to justify my treason. Think about Revelation 20, 11 through 15. Think about this, and think about God the judge is the one who is an eyewitness to every event, who all time, he is everywhere. He sees everything, and especially if you don't know Christ and you have to stand before him, there's no hope of offering false evidence to God. If he was eyewitness to every event, there's no hope. So think about that as we read these verses. Verse 11, "Then I saw a great white throne, and to him who was seated on it. From his presence earth and sky fled away, and no place was found for them. And I saw the dead, great and small, standing before the throne, and books were opened. Then another book was opened, which is the book of life, and the dead were judged by what was written in the books, according to what they had done." So, here God's memory is so certain of your deeds that it's as if he wrote them down in books, and you will be judged as an eyewitness account on everything that you have done, and there will be no hope of offering God a false testimony to your works. Verse 13, "And the sea gave up the dead who were in it. Death and Hades gave up the dead who were in them, and they were judged, each one of them, according to what they had done. Then death and Hades were thrown into the lake of fire. This is the second death, the lake of fire. And if any man's name was not found written in the book of life, he was thrown into the lake of fire." How desperately we need Jesus, and to put our faith in Jesus so that our names are still found within that book of life, or we have no hope. God, again, you'll either come to God's omnipresence and it will be an intense truth of comfort, or it will be one of utter despair. And so depending on what you do with Christ, will depend on how you view the truth that God is everywhere. Third implication, and then we'll be done here. God is present, acting in all things. Present, acting in all things. We must not think about God as being passively present. It's not like air. Air is present everywhere, or water. Water, where you find it, it's just merely filling a place. God isn't present in the sense of he just fills a place. God is acting, not only observing, but also governing and providing. So let's look at these activities of God who is everywhere. So first of all, God is everywhere governing. He is king. That's what governing is. He is king. He is essentially sovereign. That is, it is his essence. Just as it's his essence to be everywhere, it's also his essence to govern and to rule as king. God is ruling every place that he inhabits. So not only does he inhabit every place, but he rules every place that he inhabits. The older writers called this God's providential rule. God's providence is his governance of all things, people, and events. He guides and uses these for his glory and his people's good. Think about Romans 8, verse 28, a well-known verse. You probably can quote this. We know that for those who love God, all things work together for good, for those who are called according to his purpose. Only a God who is filling all places at once could be trusted to rule over all events for the good of his church. Do you believe that God is ruling over all things for his glory and for your good? If you're a Christian, if you're one of those who love God, what are some circumstances in your life where this is hard to believe? And will you trust him with those circumstances? Again, it's one thing to say we know God dwells everywhere. It's another thing to live according to that truth. For me, the success and prosperity of the church here as the pastor of it, my ability to get out into my community and win folks to Christ, the success and prosperity of my family. What about this? The protection of my loved ones in a world that is exponentially relishing evil, or lately where sickness is affecting many, many people that I love and I care about. Do I believe that God dwells in every moment, and not just that he dwells in those moments, but he governs every moment that he dwells in, and he works all things together for good? Do I believe that? Do I live in that? What about this one? And we'll end with this thought this afternoon. God is everywhere, not just governing, but he is everywhere providing. He's not passive like air. He rules and he also provides. Creation is not self-sustaining. Though God has established observable laws of nature, nature requires God to continually sustain it. Listen to that thought in Psalm 104. O Lord, how manifold are your works. In wisdom you have made them all. The earth is full of your creatures. These all look to you to give them their food in due season. When you give it to them, they gather it up. When you open your hand, they're filled with good things. When you hide your face, they're dismayed. When you take away their breath, they die and return to their dust. When you send forth your spirit, they are created, and you renew the face of the ground. So God is present with all of his creation, and he alone is capable of sustaining all life. He alone sustains everything. God is in all places, observing, governing, and sustaining. Again, Paul says in Acts 17:28, in him we live and move and have our being. This fact can bring you great rejoicing or dreadful despair, but friend, we cannot ignore it. That's the worst thing we could do, is ignore the truth that God is a God who dwells in all places, everywhere. Every place is here to God. Think about that this week. Dwell on that. The idea of this is behold your God. See him for who he really is. And then don't just let this be academic knowledge so that you can give theologically accurate answers to people's questions. Be rooted in them. Be grounded in them. Walk in them. Put them into practice in your life. How will this change the way that you live your week as you behold your God? Trust you have a wonderful day. Thanks so much for tuning in. We will see you again next week. Bye-bye.